The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chyaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Hello there, thank you for clicking on this brand new episode of Things Are About to Get Weird, and happy spooky season one and all. Here on the podcast, I think it's fair to say that there's no real start or end to spooky season. It's a year-round affair, but in honour of October and the run-up to Halloween, I thought it was about time to cover the story I have for you today. This one was suggested to me ages ago by a lovely listener of ours called Ellie, and today felt like the right moment to dive deep into the history of one of Scotland's most infamous ghouls, the MacKenzie Poltergeist. This is going to be one creepy and at times gruesome episode, so do be prepared before we begin, but that warning given, let's travel on up to the gorgeous Scottish city of Edinburgh, the backdrop for this grim, ghostly saga. On Christmas Day of 1998, a man was walking through Edinburgh's Greyfriars Kirkyard, a graveyard located in the city's old town, seeking shelter from the bitterly cold, wet weather. The man sadly had no house of his own, and as he made his way through the cemetery, he spotted an imposing mausoleum, with its domed roof, stone columns, and heavy doors flanked by steel railings. Imagining that the conditions inside were bound to be kinder than the biting chill of the outdoors, the man forced his way into the tomb to take cover. Once inside, and after his eyes had adjusted to the oppressive darkness that filled the mausoleum, he grew intrigued about the contents of the sanctuary he had found, and he tentatively started to explore. Within the tomb was a spiral staircase that led down into the crypt, and as he made the short descent down into it, he was greeted by 4 coffins, known to contain the remains of the MacKenzie family. Some reports say that as he was down on his luck, the man tried to open up the coffins to see whether anything of value lay inside, along with, of course, the skeletons of the deceased. Whether this is true or not, the events that took place next are more widely documented. As he stood near the coffins, part of the flooring beneath his feet gave way, and the man plummeted down to the level below, an area that had been largely unknown to exist prior to this moment. After the immediate shock of what had happened to him subsided, the man made a truly gruesome realization. This next part is horrible, so just be warned. He had not, in fact, fallen onto hard ground, but instead he found that he was resting on the remains of numerous long-departed souls. Some sources state that these remains were purely skeletal, but others speculate that they were not quite fully decomposed, despite having been there for centuries due to the well-sealed nature of the crypt. Whilst I'm somewhat skeptical about this and think that they probably were just bones by then, it sounds like a horrifying experience nonetheless, and the man scrambled out of the pit as quickly as he could. It's said that his screams could be heard from outside the mausoleum, and that after he managed to free himself from the crypt and flee the tomb for good, his frantic demeanour startled a dog walker who had been passing by the area, and who therefore became a witness to the aftermath of the man's ordeal. But as unsettling as this incident was, what no one could have predicted is what was to come afterwards, because it's believed by many that this Christmas Day disruption to the peace and solitude of the MacKenzie tomb was the catalyst for the seriously strange events that followed post-1998. But before we get ahead of ourselves, it's important to turn the clock all the way back to the 17th century to explore the dark history of the most notable MacKenzie family member. And it's this context that explains why many think his spirit could be behind some of the unfortunate happenings that followed the disruption of his resting place. Now, during the early 1600s, Scotland was emerging from a rather tricky time. The religious unease between the Catholics and Protestants, which had caused so much chaos during the previous century throughout Europe, had become somewhat more settled in Scotland, relatively speaking, following the Scottish Reformation. Then, after the Scottish King James VI brought about the union of the English and Scottish crowns, becoming James I in 1603, things initially seemed to be looking up for some. He was Protestant, so naturally this made things easier for those whose beliefs aligned with his. But what this meant was that the practice of Catholicism was pushed underground. That is an incredibly simplified summary, by the way, or else we'd be here for many hours. But it leads on to our next point, which is important to understand for this overall story, which is that there was then a kind of offshoot set of problems that emerged amongst Protestants. Essentially, James I was of the belief that the king should be the head of the church, whilst the Church of Scotland thought that that position was far too holy for a mortal man, and that Jesus Christ was their spiritual leader. Things remained difficult on this front by the time Charles I took the throne in 1625, and tensions grew and grew in Scotland over this matter, especially following the introduction of something called the Book of Common Prayer by King Charles in 1637, a text it was deemed treasonous to not acknowledge. Unsurprisingly, the new king shared James I's take on the issue, and the publication of this book was infuriating to many. The following year, those in Scotland who had grown tired of the interference in the Presbyterian Church of Scotland by the monarchy in relation to their worship decided to sign an opposition document called the National Covenant, and therefore became known as Covenanters. And this is where Sir George MacKenzie enters the tale. MacKenzie was a lawyer who had been born in the Scottish city of Dundee, and interestingly, he actually began his career by defending a key Covenanter, Archibald Campbell, Marquis of Argyll, when he was put on trial in 1661. The Marquis was ultimately found guilty and executed, but Mackenzie didn't let this setback keep him down for long. He almost immediately turned his attention to opposing the witch trials that took place in Scotland between 1661 and 1662, arguing that the women being persecuted were harmless and should be freed. But I'm afraid those are pretty much the first and last positive things I'm able to tell you about George MacKenzie. Now, the document I just mentioned, the National Covenant, was actually signed by the Covenanters in Greyfriars Kirk, the church that stands in the wider cemetery, and this is an important detail to remember. As the years passed, the group had grown so disillusioned with the state of religious control in Scotland that they'd begun to take up arms and fight for their rights, which culminated in the Battle of Bothwell Bridge in 1679. The Covenanters engaged in conflict with government troops but were quickly overpowered, losing approximately 600 of their members in the fight. Around 1,200 Covenanters were then taken prisoner, and their fate was placed in the hands of none other than the man who had been made Lord Advocate of Scotland 2 years prior, Sir George MacKenzie. I know that was a lot of background information to get to this point, but this context is helpful to properly set the scene. Although Mackenzie had previously been seemingly sympathetic towards the Covenanters, in a professional capacity at least, it seems that as his career had progressed, he'd had a change of heart. After being handed the task of dealing with the quote-unquote rebels, the Lord Advocate chose to embark on a path of pure brutality, so much so that it earned him the nickname Bloody MacKenzie. In an area of the Greyfriars Kirkyard, which is known today as the Covenanters' prison, Mackenzie constructed a makeshift camp where the 1,200 Covenanters were effectively left to die. Despite the dire, wintry conditions, they had little to no shelter from the elements, and were given very tiny quantities of food to fight over. This mistreatment continued for months, and as the time dragged on, more and more of the group members perished due to the atrocious conditions. At the end of their ordeal, it said that only 257 of those who had originally been imprisoned at Greyfriars were still alive. Think about that for a moment. Almost 1,000 people ended up dying from hunger, thirst, sickness, I'm sure, or simply from exposure. And those who survived had to witness all of that, their friends and comrades perishing before their eyes. As I say, it was just brutal. And unfortunately, for most of those who survived Mackenzie's jail, there was only more suffering to come. It said that many who walked out were either eventually executed or sent to America as indentured servants. But it gets worse. It's believed that the ship carrying the surviving Covenanters to America was wrecked in a storm, leaving only a handful of survivors. It's terrible to think that for so many hundreds of people, crossing paths with Bloody MacKenzie was statistically so likely to end up being a death sentence. His dire treatment of the Covenanters didn't seem to have hampered Mackenzie's career though. He continued to flourish in multiple areas of his work, publishing numerous books and even founding the Advocates' Library. After he died on the 8th of May 1691, his body was transferred from Westminster, where he passed, back up to Edinburgh, where he was buried in, you guessed it, the mausoleum we mentioned right at the start of this tale. And just to make things even more morbid, this tomb is located mere meters from the makeshift jail where he left so many human beings to die. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Chyaz, you said this was a ghost story. Where's the so-called poltergeist we were promised? But don't worry, we're now at the point where this account of dark and twisted historical deeds moves into modern times, with a quick stop-off in the 19th century. Remember at the start I mentioned that the incident of the man breaking into the Mackenzie tomb in the late 90s was thought to have kick-started a series of haunted happenings in Greyfriars Kirkyard. We'll explore those in a moment, but not before we acknowledge that this might not strictly be the case, because whilst there have certainly been lots of documented strange events post-mausoleum break-in, some think that they have found evidence of this spooky reputation stretching all the way back to the late 1800s. In the Cassell's Old and New Edinburgh records, it's mentioned that local children during this century believed that Mackenzie's spirit was restless inside the crypt, and that it was common for them to dare each other to enter the graveyard at night. Once inside, they'd shout through the keyhole of the tomb for Mackenzie to come out if he dares. Additionally, Robert Louis Stevenson, the renowned Scottish writer, penned a book called Edinburgh Picturesque Notes in 1878, and in it he wrote, quote, "When a man's soul is certainly in hell, his body will scarce lie quiet in a tomb, however costly. Sometime or other the door must open, and the reprobate come forth in the abhorred garments of the grave." And this quote was in reference to Bloody MacKenzie. How creepy is this? There are a couple of different interpretations of this quote that I've come across. Some think that it implies that the door had already opened, and that the presence of Mackenzie's malevolent spirit was already being felt in the cemetery. But the explanation I favour is that it was a scarily accurate prediction of what was to come almost exactly 120 years later, on that fateful Christmas Day, and of the occurrences that followed. So here we go. Since the late 1990s, there have been hundreds of reports made by visitors to Greyfriars who claim that they have felt the presence of an unkind spirit, with many believing it to be the ghost of Bloody MacKenzie. In fact, according to the Scotsman newspaper, the MacKenzie Poltergeist is thought to be one of the, quote, most well-documented paranormal phenomenon in the world. Around a week after the break-in, a female visitor to the kirkyard stopped off on her walk around the cemetery to gaze at the impressive mausoleum. From nowhere, she describes that she was blasted back by a cold force, as though though something inside the tomb was warning her to stay well away. Not too long afterwards, things appeared to escalate, when on at least 2 occasions, visitors were found on the ground near Mackenzie's mausoleum with mysterious injuries. One woman described that, quote, invisible hands had tried to strangle her, backed up by the appearance of strange bruising on her neck, with a young man recalling a similar experience shortly after. And then began the scratches. Back in 2020, a Glasgow man named Chris Rennie attended the Double Dead Ghost Walk, organised by the City of the Dead tour group. The tour included a wander through Greyfriars and a stop outside the mausoleum, where the attendees learned all about the bizarre encounters people believe they have had with the MacKenzie Poltergeist. Speaking to Edinburgh Live, Chris recalled what took place that evening, saying, quote, I went on my own because all my friends were too scared to go with me. It was spooky. I was about to go to bed when I felt a burning on my back. I took my t-shirt off and looked in the mirror. That's when I saw the scratches. I was stunned. The scratches were burning. I put tea tree oil on my back to try and take the pain away. By morning, the scratches had turned into welts and the skin was broken in several places and my back was bleeding. I felt drained. No one could have done it while I was on the tour because I'd have felt it. Because of the position of the scratches, there is no way I could have done it to myself. I'd been wearing a long, thick coat, so the scratches couldn't have been made by tree branches or by me leaning against a wall. And I hadn't fallen over drunk because I don't drink alcohol. It has to be paranormal. It's the only way it can be explained. Chris took some photos of the scratches and I have to say that they look really sore. They're definitely not the kind of thing that you could accidentally do to yourself without realizing it. And Chris's story is far from unique. There are numerous reports of similar incidents, and some have additional creepy details too. In an article on the fantastic Spooky Isles website, an ex-police officer who took the same City of the Dead tour on a different occasion described his encounter, saying, quote, after the tour, I decided to go back to our hotel room. I was glancing at The Ghost That Haunted Itself, a book about the story of the MacKenzie Poltergeist by Jan Andrew Henderson, when I felt a sharp burning sensation on the right-hand side of my neck. There were at least 5 deep scrapes that appeared just under my Adam's apple. On returning home the next morning, I went straight to my mother's house and told her my tale, along with handing her The Ghost That Haunted Itself, which I had decided I did not want in my home. Yesterday I phoned her and asked her what she thought of the book. Remarkably, she was just examining 5 large scratches under her Adam's apple that were identical to my own. I am not the sort of individual who frightens easily, but, hand on heart, I am very frightened now. The phenomenon you have in that graveyard prison is very real. How unsettling is that? Oh, I have the shivers. Now, there is something quite special about this City of the Dead tour, as I found out during my research. In a nutshell, after the initial encounters reported in the late 90s, the City of Edinburgh Council decided it was all a little too strange, and they actually locked up the old Covenanters prison area. And as the MacKenzie tomb lies within this space, access to the mausoleum was also then restricted. That was until the tour organiser, Jan Andrew Henderson, the author Chris mentioned in his interview, was given permission by the council to visit the tomb on the official tours. Henderson claims that he has heard thousands of accounts about supernatural attacks at the site, and the company even occasionally document new ones from group members on their social media accounts. I headed over to their website to see what further information I could dig up, and what I found was so unnerving. This is a direct quote from the site. It reads, over the years, there have been numerous reports of hotspots, cold spots and cuts, bruises and burns on witnesses' bodies, often under their clothes. Hundreds of photographs have been taken of these marks, as well as many pictures of an unidentified shape in the tomb. There have been unexplained smells and auditory anomalies, including knocking noises under the ground and inside the tomb itself. Dead animals are found, unmarked, in front of the Black Mausoleum. People have complained that an unseen apparition has pulled their hair, grabbed their legs and arms and hit them. One or two have even claimed to be possessed. The area has been exorcised twice, both times unsuccessfully. Poltergeist activity has been reported in 4 different houses around the graveyard, and the area is plagued by fires. Oof. And here we arrive at one of the most frightening parts of this tale, and one of the first things I read about when I started to look into it. In October of 2003, Jan Andrew Henderson was actually living in a house situated within the graveyard, just across from the Covenanters prison. He was busy working on a book he was writing about the MacKenzie Poltergeist, and was so enthralled by the tale that he'd not only set up his home within the vicinity of the Lord Advocate's resting place, but the offices of the tour company too. But that month, disaster struck. Both Henderson's home and office were destroyed in a fire, along with all of his possessions, including, quote, years worth of letters, photographs, records, and statements concerning the MacKenzie Poltergeist. He explained that none of the surrounding properties were damaged, and no official cause for the fire has ever been determined, leading many to speculate that it could have been the work of Mackenzie's spirit. If I were Jan Andrew, I would have never set foot in Greyfriars again after this, but he's clearly a more hardened ghost hunter than I will ever be. Then, the very next year, in 2004, something happened at the MacKenzie tomb that is both disturbing and bizarre, and I have no doubt that it contributed to the general lore about the utter creepiness of the place. This is absolutely wild. I can't believe it happened, but it did. In April that year, 2 teenagers were found guilty of violating both a grave and a corpse after breaking into the mausoleum, forcing open the tomb believed to contain Mackenzie's corpse, removing its head and taking it outside into the wider graveyard. Some reports stated that the head wasn't actually fully decomposed, which again I don't have the scientific knowledge to fully understand, but it just doesn't bear thinking about. After realizing that their jaunt had gone way too far, the teenagers panicked and stashed the head behind a gravestone in the kirkyard, around 150 meters from Mackenzie's tomb. After it was found and the whole story was unraveled, it was returned to the crypt, which was then sealed and properly secured. I feel like this episode just keeps getting stranger and stranger. The more I read and the more odd details I discover, this could easily be a multi-part series. So I definitely recommend doing some further research on this one if you have a good few hours to spare. There are seemingly endless eyewitness accounts, photographs of suspected figures taken on the tours, weird incidents in the surrounding areas that have been possibly linked to the MacKenzie Poltergeist. The list goes on, but for now I wanted to tell you about one more awful event that many think could be the work of the infamous Greyfriars resident. In the year 2000, a psychic and medium from Edinburgh named Colin Grant decided to try and perform an exorcism at the kirkyard. The 66-year-old was immediately wary of the location and described feeling evil forces there that were so strong he refused to enter the site without a Bible and cross for protection. He spoke of feeling the presence of around 200 restless spirits, who he believed to be those of the Covenanters who had perished following Mackenzie's virtual abandonment of the group in the prison. He felt that he wasn't able to perform the exorcism properly whilst he was there, and he said that he knew there was more work to be done at Greyfriars to rid it of the darkness within. Shortly after this, Colin passed away suddenly from a heart attack during a séance, and no one could ignore the warning he had given just before his death. He had expressed his belief that his attempt to rid the graveyard of Mackenzie's malevolent presence would kill him. Could Colin have sensed that some of the evil he'd encountered at the mausoleum had stuck with him? It's possible based on this eerie confession he gave before he passed. Like virtually all of the accounts in this episode, I suppose it all comes down to what you personally believe. But I, for one, would be incredibly wary of the tomb and would do not a single thing to goad any spirit within its vicinity. I think it's a very good thing that access to the Covenanters' prison and the mausoleum is controlled and limited to the official tours. And like with other places I've mentioned on the podcast, like Newsham Park Hospital, I'm not sure I'd be brave enough to actually go on the tour. Never say never, but nothing I've read during the course of my research has made me particularly keen to go. Now I know that some of you, the more skeptical amongst you most likely, will have listened to this and be thinking, I'm still not totally convinced that all of this is the work of a poltergeist. And I understand paranormal cases are always the most divisive topics I cover, and if you are skeptical, you're not necessarily alone. One of the most popular counter theories to explain the odd incidents in and around Greyfriars is something we've noted a few times on the podcast: the phenomenon of mass hysteria. Is it possible that the reputation of the cemetery is now so closely linked with the idea of the MacKenzie Poltergeist that visitors end up manifesting strange symptoms like scratches and cuts, or feeling those bizarre pushes and shoves whilst there, entirely because of their expectations of the place? Could it really be one big case of everyone's imaginations getting the best of them? Personally, I think not, but I certainly can understand why some may favour these more rational explanations. Before we finish, I did just want to briefly touch on the general fascinating history of the Greyfriars Kirkyard. Given that it's located in Edinburgh, the home of the infamous 19th century body snatchers Burke and Hare, it's hardly a surprise that in decades past, some locals wanted to take extra measures to ensure the graves of their loved ones were safe from those with ill intentions. That's why if you walk around Greyfriars, you'll be able to spot a couple of so-called mort safes, which are these large metal cages placed over certain graves to keep anyone from getting too near. They're still well intact and are considered two of the best examples you can still see today. Additionally, there are several other notable graves in the cemetery, including that of a man who passed away back in 1806 by the name of Tom Riddle, which is thought to have subconsciously inspired the character of the same name in the Harry Potter novels. And how could I not mention Greyfriars Bobby, the terrier dog who famously spent 14 years guarding the grave of his owner. There's a statue of the loyal pooch on the corner of George IV Bridge and Candlemaker Row, which attracts thousands upon thousands of visitors each year who are all eager to rub its nose, as it's said to bring good luck, though this practice is highly discouraged by locals as it started to damage the iconic monument. Bobby is actually buried just outside the kirkyard, and his gravestone reads, "Let his loyalty and devotion be a lesson to us all." How lovely is that? I thought this tale needed a wholesome intermission, but as a final thought today, I wanted to focus back onto Mackenzie, as I found a brilliant quote from Jan Andrew Henderson which rounds this story off perfectly. Here's what he said. I don't know what the MacKenzie Poltergeist really is. I don't know if it's a supernatural entity, a pheromone cloud, a demon, or a set of psychosomatic and hysterical reactions. All have been suggested, but it has become the best documented supernatural case of all time, and probably the most conclusive. Let me put it this way. If the MacKenzie Poltergeist isn't a genuine supernatural entity, then I don't think there's any such thing, not anywhere in the world. Well, I just know that this one is going to prompt some reaction. But the question is, are you firmly planted in the skeptic camp? Or has this tale only made you even more of a believer? You all know how much I love to hear your thoughts on all of our stories, but particularly ones like this, so do get in touch and let me know where you land on the MacKenzie Poltergeist saga. We'll have all of our usual outro bits and bobs coming up soon, but not before we pay a visit to our Weird Media feature. And today's shout out is one that I am extra excited about, as it's all to do with a current obsession of mine. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you'll know by now that I love a good TV series. I probably feature them a little too heavily in Weird Media, but I promise that today's recommendation is well worth it. Many of you will have already discovered this series, but I know some won't have. So allow me to introduce you to the absolute treat that is Slow Horses. It's a series on Apple TV starring Gary Oldman in the lead role alongside a whole host of incredible actors. And here's the basic premise. It's set in London and revolves around an outcast group of MI5 agents nicknamed the Slow Horses. They're stationed at a rundown building known as Slough House, away from the suave MI5 headquarters that some of them long to get back into, and have been sent there for a number of reasons, from perceived incompetence to making major mistakes on the job. It's definitely a drama thriller, but there are some lighter comedy moments in it. And I can't put my finger on exactly why, but there are elements of it that remind me of Randall and Hopkirk, which, as you might remember, was the very first Weird Media shout out I gave on the podcast. The opening titles are phenomenal, especially the music, and the show as a whole is nothing short of addictive. Series 4 has just finished and it's already been renewed for Series 5, which doesn't surprise me at all. It's hands down one of the best things I've seen in years. I know I've sung the praises of lots of TV shows in this feature, but I think Slow Horses might take the crown as the best of all. I'm a big fan of TV programmes that are based on books, which this one is, the Slough House series by the British author Mick Herron. If you love a good underdog story or seeing the dynamics play out within a group of misfits, plus of course the thrill of a spy drama, I am convinced that you'd love Slow Horses. If you've already watched it, I literally can't stop talking about it, so feel free to get in touch and tell me what you thought of the latest series. It really is something special. Right, time for our Saw shout-outs, and there are rather a lot today, so I'll try to speed through them. We had a great article from historycollection.com by Natasha Sheldon from October 2018. 2 pieces from the Edinburgh Live publication, one by Dana McAlpine from July 2020, and the other by Sean Traynor from October 2022. There was a great Mental Floss article by Siobhan Ball from October 2020, and another from the Daily Beast by Nina Strochlik from July 2017. We had 2 articles from the Scotsman newspaper, one from September 2006 and the other from April 2004. A brilliant piece from the Spooky Isles website by MJ Steele Collins from December 2017, and another from the Icy Sedgwick website from October 2021. A piece from the Edinburgh Evening News by Rachel Mackey from July 2020, the website greyfriarskirk.com, an Atlas Obscura piece by Annetta Black from March 2013. The City of the Dead Tours website was fantastic. And finally, a BBC Scotland article about the Scottish Reformation and the website covenanter.org.uk, all about the Covenanters. Oof, we got there in the end. Anyway, as promised, here are all of the ways that you can get in touch. On Instagram and also Threads, just look up at Things Get Weird Podcast. On TikTok, we are at Things Are About to Get Weird. And on Facebook, you can find us by searching for the podcast name. That's where you'll find our main page and our private discussion group. Our email address is thingsgetweirdpodcast@gmail.com. And if you've enjoyed this episode, I would massively appreciate a quick rating or review wherever you're listening. Finally, feel free to use that fantastic comments function if you're listening on Spotify today. Thank you all so much once again for tuning in today, and I'll be back to chat to you all again next week in a brand new installment of Weird Fix. So until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.